Well, we now hit episode 2 in our mini-series on the Book of Ruth that Cecily started last week. Now, if you missed Cecily's introduction to Ruth last week, you can go to our YouTube channel, St Stephen's Anglican Church, Belrose, and go back and have a look. But for those who were watching her talk last week, you might be interested to know that ratings for Les Miserables that she mentioned have now gone through the roof since her talk last week. I'll leave that with you. In the meantime, let me give you the recap. Now, Cecily left us with Naomi angry with God in episode 1, having to return to Bethlehem basically empty and with nothing, and it seems with no prospects for the future as well. And yet, in spite of all of this, she is accompanied by her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who is so kind and committed to her mother-in-law that she says to her in chapter 1, "Your people will be my people, your God will be my God." She was willing to ditch her homeland of Moab to do this. Now, would you do that for your mother-in-law? Something to think about. So we left the pair arriving in Bethlehem, and as we did, there was just a little glimmer of hope as they were arriving at the time of the beginning of the barley harvest in Bethlehem. So in today's episode, we're asking the question, well, how are Naomi and Ruth going to be provided for, given they had nothing? And secondly, how is God going to answer Naomi's prayer, which was in Ruth chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, when she prayed, "May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." That was in verses 8 and 9. So, episode 2. Now, in episode 2, we're going to see a string of seemingly unconnected parts being drawn together by the precision of God and by his kindness in answering these two questions today. Now, what are these seemingly unconnected parts that are coming together thanks to God? Well, there are 3 of them. Now, one is the kindness of God, as seen in his law. Number 2 is the kindness of God's man, Boaz. And number 3 is the kindness of Ruth herself towards her mother-in-law and towards God in doing so. But underneath all of this, all of these 3 things, of course, is God, his steadfast love, or as we're going to find out today, his hesed, and I'll talk to you more about that in a minute. The same love that we see through Jesus today. So let's talk about the kindness built into God's law. So Ruth and Naomi get to Bethlehem at harvest time, and Ruth begins to glean behind the harvest. So let's talk about gleaning. Now, when the harvest was ready to collect in the times of Ruth and Naomi, it was a pretty messy business. There were no modern tools or harvesters, so the process was really quite inefficient. By God's law of gleaning, and you'll find that in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 and 10, God's people with fields could only glean and collect the sheaves themselves once, and then had to leave the margins of their field unharvested so that the poor and the have-nots could collect all the sheaves that were left over. So already generosity and kindness is built into God's law. Why? Because God cares for the poor, he cares for the weak, and he wants the poor to have a meal. So already God is slowly answering this question, how will Naomi and Ruth? Then we get to the second seemingly unconnected part, and that is the kindness of God's man, Boaz. Now, when I looked through this story of Boaz, I was thinking we all need a Boaz, don't we? He is so good, Boaz. Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "Let me go and glean with the farmer where I can find favour." But there weren't too many farmers like that because Ruth was a foreigner. And even though the law included foreigners, a space for foreigners, there weren't too many farmers who were going to let her glean, being a Moabite too. So it just happens that Ruth picks a field to glean on owned by Boaz, who, it turns out, just happens to be a relative of Naomi's dead husband. So the relation between Boaz and Naomi is going to be very important for episode 3, but you'll have to come back next week to hear about that one. Now, with God, though, there are no coincidences, only God incidences. And so all these seemingly disconnected parts, God's grace through his law of gleaning, the kindness of God through Boaz, are all coming together from God to answer Naomi's prayer and answer our question. Now, who is Boaz? Well, the Book of Ruth says he is a man of standing. Last week, I heard a wonderful story. Someone I know, a young mum, a single mum with 2 young kids who lives down at the south coast in a tiny home, literally a tiny home, on an open field, sort of in the middle of nowhere, came home one day with her kids to find by the side of her tiny cold home a winter supply of wood cut by 2 lovely Christian men from the local church nearby. And you know what? My heart really popped when I heard that. It was just a wonderful story of kindness and generosity. Now, Ruth, under God's providence, just happens to meet a good man like these 2 good men I just talked about, and his name is Boaz. Now, Boaz, we already hear he's a good worker. He comes from Bethlehem. And when he comes from Bethlehem to his property, he greets his workers with a blessing. The Lord be with you. And they return the favour. The Lord bless you. So again, another unconnected part comes into play. Ruth entering Boaz's life through her gleaning on his field. Thank you, Lord. And then the third unconnected part here is Ruth's kindness to Naomi, her mother-in-law. Now you may be wondering, what's this got to do with answering our questions for episode 2? Let me segue. Have you heard of a lady called Daphne Dunn? Let me tell you who Daphne Dunn is. She was an Australian in her 90s, a war widow, and one day she heard about the great work done by Prince Harry for war veterans, Harry himself being a former soldier. And she was so moved by Prince Harry's work that when Harry came to visit Australia about 5 years ago, Daphne Dunn went out of her way to be in the crowd, get up the front, she's in a wheelchair, and she, waved at Prince Harry, and Prince Harry stopped because he wanted to talk to this lady, so passionate to meet him. And they shared stories of war veterans, and Daphne shared her story of her husband. And Harry was so moved by Daphne Dunn that the next time he visited Australia and Daphne was in the crowd again, he went out of his way to go up to Daphne again and greet her and talk with her again. And then a third time, when Meghan Markle came out to Australia with Harry, Harry went out of his way to introduce her to Daphne, who was again in the crowd. And it was just a touching story born out of mutual kindness and the good work done by Harry himself. Just the goodness creates opportunity, doesn't it? And new interactions. And this is the third piece of the puzzle coming together. So Boaz asks who this woman is on his field, who's gleaning. Now I think, how wonderful is that Boaz cares enough for the poor that he notices them enough to ask who the person is. Then his workers share the story of Ruth with Boaz, and they tell Boaz of her commitment to her mother-in-law, and not only that, of the incredible work she's putting into just to make sure she gets enough food for Naomi and herself, with only a short rest. Because of that kindness of Ruth towards Naomi, Boaz is touched and moved enough to act to help Ruth. So because of these 3 acts of kindness, there's an answer to Naomi's prayers and the question of how they're going to be provided for. The grace of God through his law of gleaning towards the poor. 2, the kindness of God's man Boaz. And 3, the kindness of Ruth towards her mother-in-law being made known and touching the lives of others. So Boaz lets Ruth glean among the sheaves. And not only that, he gets his workers to pull bundles out for her to collect as she's going along. So you can imagine her coming home with, it says there, and you remember Neil in his reading said, 13 kilos of these sheaves. And Naomi going, well, whose field did you glean in today? It's so abundant. Not only that, Boaz basically adopts her as his own servant, one of the harvesters. She gets to share the table with them and his table too, through his generosity and kindness. And Boaz also says to Ruth, look, come again to my field. Don't go to anyone else's field. I want to protect you from the young men who could assault you in the fields, he says. These are dangerous times, in chapter 2, verse 9. All these seemingly disconnected parts, God brings together out of his kindness to provide for Naomi and Ruth. And this leads to what's happening underneath those 3 unconnected things. It's God's steadfast love. Now, in the Old Testament, there's a Hebrew word, hesed, and it means steadfast, unfailing love and kindness. You've heard it used elsewhere. In the Psalms, for example, Psalm 25:7, it says, remember not the sins of my youth and my rebellious ways. According to your steadfast love, remember me, for you are good, O Lord. Now, God's hesed for us is costly, other-centred, generous, and full of grace and love towards you and me. And so this hesed of God, his unfailing love, is what we see today lived out among the law of God, God's man Boaz, and Ruth. Here it is on display, and God working behind the scenes. Naomi puts it well. When Ruth comes back home in verse 20, she says to Ruth, well, God's goodness doesn't give up on the living or the dead. She's so happy. And you know what? God doesn't give up on you or me either. Even when we are rebellious and we've turned our backs on him, he always is welcoming us back and is thrilled when we turn from our old ways and return to him in Jesus. Now, for Boaz to show God's love as well to a foreigner is a really big deal. And what it shows is that Boaz truly understands the heart of God, that heart of God is love. And we're called to show this love towards all people who God puts across our path. So let's thank God for his hesed, and let's ask God to make us bring the love of God in Jesus to all of those people who God brings across our path. Because, of course, the ultimate display of God's unfailing and steadfast love, his hesed, is the sending of his own precious Son, Jesus, to the cross in order to make you and I have peace with him again by Jesus paying that price for us of our sin on the cross in our place. That's the most costly of God's hesed of all. So stay tuned for episode 3 live in our church building, live stream 2 for you next week.